Thank you all for continuing with this effort and helping us, bearing us with the inconveniences. We also have a link now, but we would want to start with a request that please do not put your questions in the chat box when the talk is going on. We'll have the last 5 to 10 minutes reserved for this, where you can put your questions after the speaker has finished his talk. You could put down the questions in the chat box. Alternatively, if you are following the link, you could direct the questions to the Gmail account that is there. Okay. I request Professor Sundar Sarukai to begin his presentation for the day. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sundar.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ritesh. It's great to be back, and I'm glad that some of you have sustained the energy to come back. And I hope there's no problem with the sound today. Thanks to Devansh and Ritesh for fixing some of these glitches, and I look forward to a far more interactive, enjoyable remaining 7 sessions. So, as I said yesterday, I'm going to focus on this idea of what is science today, so that in order to understand better on how philosophers and historians have understood the nature of science, in order to make sense of the relationship between science and society. So there are many aspects to this question of what is science, and I want to focus on certain aspects which have direct relationship to our larger discussion on science and society. So, but before I start that, I'll just very briefly respond to some of the points raised in the questions yesterday, which was sent to me. There are many questions which I will be dealing with down the line. As I said, the way I have structured this is to have separate thematic presentations in different lectures. For example, one on science and religion, one on science and Marxism, one on science and the state, and other one scientific rationality and rationality of the social, and so on. So those questions which directly deal with that, I've noted it down. I'll come back to it when we engage with those themes in greater detail. But there are a couple of questions immediately related to what we spoke about yesterday, which I may not come back to later. So let me make a quick comment on that. There was at least 3 or 4 interesting comments on trust. And I think that raises a very important question about the idea of the trust as not just flowing from the scientist to the public, or not just flowing from the public to the scientists. It is not that you expect a society to trust scientists about what they think about the world and how they create technologies which engage with our society and which transform our society. And at one level, you would expect, the science community would expect that we trust them on what they say about the coronavirus, for example, without having to tell us, without having to convince us. And that's a model of science which has existed before. It's almost like the model of a doctor to whom you go to, and the doctor will say, okay, take these medicines, without having to tell you why you should be doing certain things. You know, that notions of more the communicative praxis, which takes each at the same level. So this question was raised by 2 or 3 people, one of which was, why should we expect trust only from the public to science? Or should the scientists also trust the public and trust the larger society? As I said, one of the great challenges in the Indian context is this question: how much do the scientists or the scientific establishment or people who speak on behalf of science believe that the so-called ordinary people are, if not scientific in the sense they are scientific, but at least that they are rational, autonomous, decision-making individuals. Okay, when we talk a little more about science, I'll tell you why we came to this particular point. And if you look at the way in which the discourse has developed in India, there's definitely a kind of a problem in the way people who are so-called quote-unquote uneducated, who belong to the marginal sections, who do not come from particular kinds of education, or the so-called narratives about tribals and others, or point out to a kind of a suspicion that they lack certain something. And that something is about a core of what constitutes being scientific. And as we saw yesterday, the whole debate on scientific temper and scientific rationality implies this. So it's a very interesting point to ask, how should the trust be manifested from the scientists to the larger society? And another person had actually raised a point about how this is related to the question of science communication. It's very correct. I think, let me just give you one anecdotal example, again, just to indicate larger contours of this rather than make a particular specific point. You know, when you listen, for example, to scientists speaking to the non-scientists, typically you would hear, for example, if you go listen to a talk on quantum theory, you know, I have heard so many talks which begin with something like this: don't worry, I will not make it complicated, I will not show you the equations and so on, you will understand it. And this idea that science communication is about the dumbing down of science to the extent that we all can understand it, the larger world around them can understand it, is correct at some point, because obviously if you're not trained in, let's say, the mechanics of science, the, let's say, calculus and so on, you're not going to be able to understand what's happening with, you know, the wave equation or solutions to the wave equation and so on. But there are different ways of communicating this, different complexities which are present, which people who are listening, who do not belong to that scientific community, can really understand. So there is a question in science communication, the idea that you can communicate some ideas so that other people can understand without worrying about the difficulty of science. And we all understand scientific discourse, like other discourses, are very difficult. In fact, if you read a philosophy book, very often most students who first encounter a philosophy book will say, my God, I don't understand what they are saying. Why don't they say clearly what they want to say? Social science texts for a lot of our students are problematical because they are not immediately accessible. They are not immediately transparent to us. And so are scientific texts, but in a different way, because there is a particular way in which those discourses are structured. There is also another important question on the different meanings of trust, and that trust, when we talk about trust between scientists to the public, there are actually different meanings of trust, and what kind of trust are they talking about? I think that's an important point to add to this debate. I will not answer this directly here, but if you really ask ourselves, all of us as consumers of a scientific technological world, of consumers of scientific truths about the universe, and ask ourselves, why do we trust what the scientists say about the world? And I think there is a self-reflection there will actually give us the different meanings of trust which are operational here. We could be trusting the knowledge which comes from science. We could be trusting the intentions of scientists, that they actually mean well, but perhaps what they are saying is not correct and so on. But that is something which, when we go more and more into the relationship between science and society, let me see if we can unpack it a little more. So the other questions about science, religion, science relation to state, etc., we will come back to, including science and education. There's a question on traditional knowledge, which I'll come back to today. And the last point I'll very quickly take is another physicist question. And I think he's making a very important point, that when I was very careful when I mentioned about the Nobel Prize, saying that India has not got a Nobel Prize for work done in India post-independence, and it is not reflective of the quality of science directly. I think it's a little more complex question. I don't want to dismiss it entirely. But what he points out is these days Nobel Prizes are not about great ideas, but largely have become more about techno-science. And so in India, our weakness is really in the technological domain, the really high cutting edge technologies and experimental systems which we need for all this, for probably leading up to the Nobel Prize. And that's a very fair comment. But it's, again, and the whole point about the Nobel is not to be taken seriously. It is just a rhetorical use of how to ask the question about quality from non-scientists. Because I must tell you that, like all communities, like all tribal and caste communities, when you are within a community of scientists, they will tell you, they'll be very critical of science communities. And scientists are very critical people, right? They have a lot of problems with a lot of things, including their departments and the kind of work which is done. And they know very correctly, they know well the kinds of problems, the politics of publishing and so many other things. But it's very interesting that when they look at the larger society, when the society asks them the larger questions, then it becomes a little more problematical. That is, people then tend to close ranks. It's like if you want to complain within the family, keep it within the family. Don't take it outside. And the outside is a society for the science community. And that's really the problem. So the real challenge of good science and technology studies as well as good scientific research in the country is to be able to have a far more meaningful, respectful dialogue across both directions. Okay, with these prefatory comments about these questions, and again today, when whatever questions you have, we'll build it up, and I think it's important that these questions are raised. I'll now, what I want to do today is to look a little more carefully at what could be the meaning of science, especially for all of us looking at it from outside science, not just as historians or philosophers of science, but also as people, as members of a society which is interacting with the larger questions of science. So I'm going to try and pull out some very essential questions, what I think are essential questions in the context, in the debate between science and society, and hopefully we will see if we can get a little bit better grasp on what constitutes the idea of science, and why the idea of science is very special. In what sense is it special, and why is it very special? So the first point which I will start with as my PowerPoint is loading, and hopefully you can all see this, is that we can go back to the question of asking what is. There was also a comment in the last chat box about references, and which I will send a list of references. I was also waiting to see what are the kinds of topics I would cover before connecting the topics to the kinds of readings I would give. But what is science is also the title of one of my books, which is there in the web, which you can download. It's meant to be a so-called introductory text on history and philosophy of science, largely philosophy of science. And I begin with this question of asking, what is science? If I want to understand the question of, the different uses of the word science, what are the kinds of questions that we could start with? The first thing that we saw yesterday was that the word science, like society, is very ambiguous, is very dispersed, and has multiple meanings. But in the practice of science, and science as a community, there's a very startling aspect of it, which is that the word science seems to function like a stable term, a stable linguistic term, in the sense that we all seem to be comfortable using it without worrying too much about the differences of meaning. But it's composed of a very large number of disciplines, and that's an interesting point to consider, because we know that in school, for example, very often when we talk about science, you would have physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology as the exemplars of science. Now, if you really look at what has happened today, the kinds of disciplines which we have within science, there are literally hundreds of subdisciplines. If you just have to go open the various sites, and you have enough information of this on the various websites. If you look at the kinds of disciplines which fall under physics, there are an enormous number of them. In chemistry, there used to be these major disciplines like classical physics, quantum, relativity, astrophysics, and so on. But they have fissured into so many specialized subdisciplines. And chemistry, like inorganic, organic, polymer, etc., again, as I said, a very large number of them. In biology, you might be interested about a particular annotated bibliography which I saw in the net earlier. And this is actually an annotated listing of all the disciplines in biological sciences. And it's quite astounding. It's 25 pages of at least 15 entries, 15 disciplinary entries in every page of 25 pages just under biological sciences. In mathematics, the mathematics classifications, the way they classify it, they give a list of nearly 97 to, and you can extend it a little bit and say you nearly have 100 classified mathematical domains. which are seen, classification therefore is seen to be distinct in some sense, but overlapping perhaps in some other sense. But there is a need within the scientific community to recognize that there are these literally hundreds of subdisciplines. And then, obviously, to all of us who are trying to understand this, and this is a very social phenomena, right? Because it's a very large production of something under the name of science. Thousands of people working in all these different hundreds of disciplines producing something. And that is this very complex thing called scientific knowledge. But very often when we use the word science, we tend to act as if it is just one thing. It's something is common between this hundreds of these disciplines of physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and so on. Is there something like that? Is there a unity to these kinds of disciplines that make us say, oh, yeah, now I know, that is called science. Now I know what the marker of science is. But to complicate this matter, we have a completely different plethora of other disciplines. Most famous one, of course, and many of us who are part of this group, come from something called social science. And you could really ask the question of what is science within the social science, and that's a very different question altogether. But then you have now a library science, sports science, management science, and my own favorite example of home science, which is very special to India. And there are now PhD programs in home science, university programs in home science. So there are all these kinds of sciences which are proliferating. And if you look at, again, the list of this, you find that there are hundreds more. And I know that when I leave this PowerPoint to read something else, it's going to be a bit of a problem, but bear with me for a second, because that list of something which I want to read is so interesting that it is worth the small problem that we would face here. I just, okay, sorry, just give me a second. I just want to read the kind of, a list of huge list of things which are called science, which are listed under science, okay? And it's called the branches of science. And I'm just reading some parts of it. There are many types of science. You can even see a very good one in Wikipedia. And if you look at what are some of them, it's quite interesting. And they're so big that I couldn't use it because it is actually classified alphabetically, like a dictionary. But I thought the easiest one is to start from Z, because it's probably much less from Z onwards. And it starts with things like xenography, and the fact that it's listed as a branch of science itself is interesting. So, okay, we'll come back to it if any of you have specific problems with that. Xenography is study of the planet Jupiter. And then many things, many disciplines, sub-disciplines or specializations around zoo, like zoology, zoo archaeology, zoo chemistry, etc., which is okay. I'm even going to skip that. There are many of them, including zoo semiotics. And then there are something called zygology, which is defined as science of joining and fastening. Then zymology, science of fermentation. Zymurgy, branch of chemistry dealing with brewing and distilling. And of course, for many of you, you may not know this, although you may be consumers of this product. It's called zythology, which is the study of beer. And this is just with Z, and you can go, as I said, I just chose a few just to indicate things which are not in the regular medical science or other science things. There's a discipline, a term called tegestology, which is study and collecting of beer mats. Tempestology, study of tropical disciplines. Phonetics, study of pronunciation. Tribology, study of friction. There's something called, I can't pronounce half of these things, it's called Siganology, which is study of gypsies. Ternary, art of turning in a lathe. And then similarly, there's a discipline called uranology, which is study of rust molds. Vexillology, which is study of flags. Winology, which is a very interesting discipline again, which is scientific study of wines and winemaking. Xylology, which is study of wood, and so on. So, you'll have to ask yourself, what is the study? I mean, what is this idea that they're all saying study of, and what is it that they're really studying? And what is so special to the idea of study that seems to be so important to many of these disciplines? What exactly is at stake when people are using the word study as a way to indicate what is it to do science? And I think that's a very good starting point for us. We will not enter into the debate of whether scientists think any of these social science, sports science, management science, home science are called science. We know that they probably not, we know that not probably, we know that they do not think that they're really science, because within science we have this hierarchy of hard science and soft science and so on. But the fact that as a social process, as a kind of legitimization for the larger society, when disciplines start to attach the term science to them, you'll have to ask the question, what is happening here? Why are they doing that? What do they hope to get from doing this kind of a thing? So I'm not going to get into the political reflections on this. This will come. We have 6 more sessions to go, but I want to look at it in the context of epistemology, in the context of knowledge. Take them seriously and ask, well, if there are hundreds of subdisciplines under physics, chemistry, biology, etc., what could be common? So this is a very typical philosophical question, you know, and you could ask something like this and say, there must be something which makes them fall into the word science. And I want to start with just 2 possibilities. One is the fact, I hope you cannot see the PowerPoint because I have no idea whether you're able to see it. Ritesh, are they able to see the?
Yes, sir, we can see you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So there are 2 possibilities. One, you could say that these are all sciences. So let's just stick with the first part and forget about the more problematical home science, etc., etc. Let's just stick to the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, you know, biology. Some people say soft science. Let's call it all as hard science: physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, immunology. I mean, there are so many of those branches in that, as I told you. Maybe one of the things which are common to them, which makes them be called as science, is that they have a common type of objects of study, the objects they study. Or if you like, for social science students, we often use the term the objects of discourse, those things we talk about, okay? And that can be a much broader definition, but let's call this as objects of study. So physics talks about, let's say, the natural world, the universe, natural processes, material world, etc. Chemistry might talk about, again, matter in a very fundamental sense, about molecules, etc. Biology about life systems and so on. And this question, which I won't talk about here, which I'm sure many of you must have thought about, is why is mathematics even grouped under this? Because it doesn't seem to be doing any of the things which the other sciences really seem to do. But there are these questions of probably some notions of common objects of study. And secondly, there is another possibility. It is not just that they all have a kind of a similar kind of things. Let's see what that could be. But other than that, there is another common thing which probably characterizes them. And I think really the task of a lot of philosophy of science has been to try and understand this. And with this is the way these objects are studied, the means of studying them, the analysis, how do you even approach these things, and what do we mean by studied? Because studied is a little bit of a vague term. Studied is what? What exactly do you mean that you are studying an object? Let's say I have a rock in front of me. What does it mean to study it? Is there a particular way of doing it? Is that what really defines that something is science or what it is not science? So let's look at one candidate for objects of study for science, which is nature and universe. Very standard, classical science, if you like. You begin with wonder at nature, wonder at the universe. And you can see this in all traditions, across cultural groups, that the study of motion was an extremely important part, which becomes the first question for classical physics, if you like. The study of motion, meaning that why do things move? How do I characterize something moving? So if I drop a stone and it falls to the ground and I want to describe its falling, that's really what we are talking about. I want to understand. I want some way of understanding that object of study. So here, when we talk about nature and the universe, there are objects in the nature, there are objects in the universe, and you can see, right in the beginning, and one of the greatest books, the most foundational books in science, Newton's Principia Mathematica, it's also a very important classical, I would say, one of the magnum opus of philosophy, because Newton refers to his work within the new Principia Mathematica as methods of philosophy, not methods of science. So there is this preoccupation, and he has a structure of the way the nature is, and he's trying to describe some aspects of nature. So even if you're describing nature and universe, for example, you can describe objects, like we saw the two things which we do. One is material things like rock, mountains, water, whatever it is. There are millions of phenomena around you to describe. Things around you to try and understand. And then you also describe millions of phenomena. And as I said, although classical physics, the Newtonian physics, begins with trying to understand the phenomenon of motion. What is it? How do you characterize motion? We should remember that this is still really not unique to science, because the first set of one of the most important questions which begins, which really initiates philosophy across the traditions, whether it's the Indian, the African, or the Greek, is actually the study of change and motion. The first major question for philosophers is the question of change. What does it mean when something changes? And motion is a classic example of change, because a body is moving, something is changing, but how do you characterize that change? And now we know so much that we say immediately, oh, x by t, velocity x by t, etc., how much distance it moves, etc. But to reach the point that when an object is going from here to there, it is actually moving in a background space, you need to wait till Newton to be able to recognize that. So this is, in a sense, this is what really science does. But in this sense, science has a lot of overlap with philosophy. And we know that, definitely till Newton's time, science was still called natural philosophy, a philosophical study of nature. But this kind of looking at, knowing that there are both things and phenomena which are objects for study of science. And here I'm restricting myself to nature, so we can call ourselves as saying objects of study for science are natural things and natural phenomena, rainbow, blue sky, etc. Fine. So let's assume I know how the objects of study are. But then how do I study them? How am I going to study the rainbow, the blue sky, etc., the falling object? If somebody writes a poetry about a falling stone, would you consider that as science? Will Nature or Science publish an article which is a poetry about coronavirus rather than other kinds of things about the coronavirus? And there we know, obviously, that there's a very clear demarcation which characterizes what is science. And this is the very important aspect in contemporary times about what science is. It's a pity that even scientists do not recognize that the question of objects of study for science is actually very, very important, because it says something very unique about the nature of science. And there's been a lot of talk about the second part, which is a particular way of studying and knowing. So we do understand that somebody might tell you that, yes, I accept that poetry about a falling stone is maybe truthful, if you like, quote unquote truthful, is very useful for me to understand, but I may still not want to call it science. And that I think is fair. So we can work with that part. But when I say that science is a particular way of studying, can I characterize that? So is it the case? So here what I'm trying to do is trying to find out what the strength of science is. Why is it that science seems to have such a dominant influence on social structures? And how do we understand science before we even ask the question, is that fair, is it good, or is it working well, etc., etc. So the first question is there a method that is common in all these disciplines? Is that a science? So if you look at the definitions of science, and it's also very interesting that over the last few decades, there has been a lot of pressure on various science academies around the world to start giving a definition of science. And some of these definitions of science are present. You can open the various academies of science around the world, and you will see something they will say about what they mean as science. Because today, science has become socially contested. Because one of the things you're worried about is you have certain amount of budget for, let's say, the Department of Science and Technology, and then I want to call philosophy also as science, and I send them a project. Obviously, they don't want to fund me because they don't think philosophy is a science, for example. Then it is very important to know what they will accept as science and what they won't accept as science. So one of the common ways by which people have tried to describe the processes which are essential to science are typically, these are all the typical catchwords. It's a systematic collection of knowledge, some way of systematizing. Systematizing means putting together in a particular way, in a larger structural, systematic way. It has the ideas of observation is very important. This means that you can't just speak on top of your mouth, top of your head. You will have to have notions of observation which underlie what you say, which defends, which justifies what you say. The question of hypothesis is actually also very important within science, because it talks about a very important aspect of science, which we again don't talk as much about, which is its constant attempt to keep growing. This constant obsession with newness is extremely important for science. It's not that, scientists are going to say, wow, we know so much, we have produced so much of knowledge, because every week there are thousands of scientific journals publishing, research, so-called new research results, and we haven't even digested probably 5 to 10% of them. So it's not that one day the scientists are all going to say, wow, we have so much, so let's just sit down and, we can live off this. It's like your fixed deposit in the bank. You can live off this for the next 100 years. No, that's not the way science is going to work. There's a constant pressure of the new, a constant pressure to produce the new. And that has a very deep societal implication. And the other important aspect of science is testing, not taking anything for granted. This goes back to the fundamental question, the belief about science as resisting authority. And we will do a session when I talk about the relationship between natural and social, about the meaning of authority in science and in society. There is also the very important terms are again experimentation, justification, evidence. Evidence has now become so popular in the media that you can't listen to a newscast on either climate change or coronavirus without hearing about the word evidence 100 times. But one of the things which philosophers like to do, and may not say much about us, is to throw a little bit of cold water when people seem very comfortable that they have understood something. Evidence has become so obvious that you say, yeah, I know what evidence is. But, philosophers of science are actually, engaged very deeply in the question of what constitutes evidence, how does something become evidence, and what is it an evidence of? That's an extremely important question. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go much into it, but if there are questions later on, we can talk about it. Because there is evidence. We accept there are data in the world. For example, the very famous common example in philosophy of science is about the data set for Ptolemaic astronomy and Copernican astronomy. And the argument there is for Ptolemy, who by looking at the sky and the position of the stars, etc., Ptolemy comes up with a calculation, and it's very mathematical, geometrical, to claim that the earth is the center of and the sun goes around the earth. Now, people argue that with the same data, Copernicus, the same is, of course, we will have to understand what exact same means, but this is the argument at least posted within the history of science. Within the same set of data, Copernicus could interpret that data to suggest that the earth is the center and not the sun is the center and not the earth. So evidence is something which is a little more complex, because I know that the evidence is present as data in various ways, but what they actually imply, that connection between evidence and what they stand for, is actually a very important part of scientific method. And for those of you who have done logic, can immediately see where the question of logic really comes within science. In these characterizations, so again, remember, just to remind you, we were asking the question in all these thousands of these small sub-disciplines of science, and they want all of them call themselves as science. These are probably the common elements which are present in them. There are many of the elements which I told you earlier, which is about observation, etc., which we saw here, hypothesis, testing, evidence, and so on, are related in the larger theory-experiment connection. Theory seems to be something very special to science. It has derived an enormous amount of power, power in every sense of the word from its use in science. And so now, of course, you have social theory and psychological theories and so on. But theory is something which seems to be very unique to science. It is not as much, it doesn't arise in other kinds of domains of knowledge. So we need to look at that question a little bit. And the other extremely important part, which people believe characterizes science, anything called science, they believe, has to obey this principle that scientific knowledge, that what science claims now is fallible. It is, by that we mean that it could be wrong. The fact that it could be wrong, it is not written in stone, it is not something which is not negotiable. That is never a question within science. That's one of the strengths of science, and it's often been used as a principle which counters science with religion, in saying that religious truths or religious texts have written established truths, and scientific truths in opposition or in contrary to that are those which can be shown to be potentially wrong. And we know from the history of science that the growth of science has often come when you have pulled down an earlier truth which you thought was accepted truth within the scientific community. Now, this itself is a very fascinating discussion, and again, we can't go too much into it, but it's worth keeping this in mind because this becomes an extremely important point in engagement between science and society. These ideas of what constitutes scientific knowledge. Again, if there are very specific questions about the fallibility, we will come to that. But let's assume we accept this very simple zeroth order definition of science and say, well, any activity which shows these kinds of elements in them, the objects of knowledge being, the kind of things we saw, nature, universe, etc. And then you have the particular ways of studying those objects, which are as what I defined earlier, and accepting that doing science is to create something called theory, which I'll explain what it actually means, doing experiments, and also the fact that the knowledge you create in science is potentially false. And it can be shown to be false. It's open. Strength of scientific system is that they are open to the fact that knowledge can be changed, even if it is a little bit, etc., or maybe radical, which is the big paradigm jumps. But we could ask, in the context of social scientists or philosophers, we could go a little bit more deeper into these terms which they have used to characterize science. When asked the question, but hey, hold on a second. What does it really mean to be systematic? What is this notion of systematic experiment? What actually should theory look like? What do we actually mean by that? Does science give you a framework by saying this is what I define as experiment and nothing else is called as experiment? How do we understand that? And why would we ask this question? Why would we ask more clarification on these terms? Because there are a wide variety of human practices. Cooking is my favorite example. It's also, if I was not doing all this, it would be my favorite pastime, I guess. Cooking, football, which is my other favorite pastime. So you could take cooking and football, for example, and say, well, if you look at cooking, for example, it is systematic. There are recipe books. It is experimental. And there are theory in some, if you mean by theory, some understanding of how things should combine, etc. It is actually, as those of you who, or any of us who start cooking first time, for example, okay, you realize that things which look so simple when others have cooked that for us, when you try and do it, even with the recipe, it can be quite impossible. It's so difficult to do so many dishes, although the recipe will say just mix this rice powder with something and boil it, fry it, and that's it. You'll never get the dish like you have tasted from people who have done this repeatedly over years. And do they have something called systematic knowledge? Have they not experimented? Have they experimented? Are they also not dealing with material? And there's nothing more natural than the food that we eat in some sense. So should that be vaguely called as science? And for those who may think it may not be, you should just, I think cooking is a lot very similar to the way chemistry is organized, chemistry labs work and so on. And if you really, it's not a big accident that in home science as a course, as a discipline, you have cooking as a subject which is taught. And I think that makes very good sense. But in what sense are they doing science? That's something which we will have to try and understand. Similarly, even in any game, there are so many aspects of learning which has happened. So much complex knowledge which you possess, which you have learned empirically, which you have learned through experimentation, which you have learned through intervention, hypothesis, how to you kick the ball in a particular way. Would that constitute a kind of a science then? And then the very major contentious debate about the history of science. Even today, I find it astounding that it is so difficult to get medical scientists in India to even accept the fact that Ayurveda, in terms of the medical knowledge corpus that it possesses, is a valid knowledge system. I don't want to call it valid science, etc. It's even a valid knowledge system. I've had discussions and debates with medical doctors who, the moment I ask them about some specific, let's say, drug of an Ayurveda, they immediately bristle and they say, well, that's not a science, I won't talk about it. So I'm curious about it. It's not a judgment about them. I'm curious to know, what exactly do you mean by science? That you keep aside a system of knowledge which is produced through experimentation. Ayurveda is based on extensive theoretical understanding of the body, theoretical understanding of health, experimental, deeply empirical, in ways in which, refined over hundreds of years, in ways in which very few knowledge systems can ever produce that kind of knowledge, because that kind of time frame has not gone by. We can ask similar questions about Indian technology, the kinds of productions of steel, zinc making, dye. There are enormous amount of examples of that. Some of the great works in this, of course, you should look at Dharampal's multi-volume text. And for those who are suspicious of Indians writing about Indian technology, etc., read Michael Adas's wonderful book on technology, which I will share some of these as later on in the thing. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, astrology, which I won't dare to say anything now. But the reason about astrology is because it's been a contentious question about whether it's a science or not, and whether it mimics certain aspects of science. Is there a theory in it? Is there experiment in it? Is there intervention in it? So is it really a science with wrong premises? Is it a science in terms of processes of argument and analysis? Or is it, so if that is true, then it is a science, but because of its fundamental assumptions may itself be faulty, so the starting assumptions are wrong, therefore the objects of discourse are not part of science. So there are different ways of answering that question, but this is just to connect you to what has been a very important debate in some societies, particularly in India. Now, one way to understand this is that to give you a distinction between football, cooking, etc., and what these people, the scientists, would like to call as science, is that all these terms of systematic, experiment, observation, etc., although they seem very local, very common, they are very specialized terms. And there are very specific use of those terms. And more importantly, this is an extremely important characteristic of science, which is, as I said, this is the point which I want to emphasize, because to me it's a way to understand what social science and other disciplines can do in their engagement with science, which is that even when science says it talks about nature, even when it says it's interested in talking about a rock, for example, a scientific description of a piece of rock, it is not interested in talking about everything about that object. For the object to become an object of science has to be prepared. It is like the closest I can think of now in this term is like the medical doctors when they do an operation. You say, suppose I go to a doctor and I'm going to get operated. It's not that the doctor, I'm just going to sit in front of the doctor and he's going to open up something and do something, right? He has to prepare my body. And the preparation of the body is what? What does it mean? It could mean various things, giving me anesthesia, choosing a particular part of the body which will be cleaned, etc., and cut and so on. That preparation of the body is just a indication of the fact that what scientific description is about, what scientific intervention is about, is not towards the whole complete thing, but only to that part of the thing which is graspable by science. So science needs to prepare an object to be able to grasp it. Okay? And so again, I'm just struggling perhaps to give you, okay, let me give you a very loose analogy, and I'm sure you can think of much better ones. Suppose I want to grasp an object which is very smooth and I'm not able to grasp it. And, I want to grasp it. And grasping, we should remember, is a very important metaphorical use for many things, including the idea of concepts. In the German tradition, it is also grasping is about understanding, learning, knowing, etc. So let me use the tactile meaning of grasping, and I want to grasp an object which is very smooth, and I'm not able to do it because neither my hands have the capacity to hold it and the object is very smooth. So what I do is I prepare the object for grasping. I scratch it in certain parts so it becomes a little more rough and it allows me a capacity to hold it. Science does this to any object it talks about. There are very few automatically prepared objects of science. They can be prepared in lab as objects for science. But the natural world, the social world, gives very complex objects around it. And science has to find a way to, create and prepare the object in the same way that it also prepares phenomena. And this, again, I think to me is an extremely important point. If we grasp this, we really will begin to understand where the major conflict between science, when seen in the context of society, comes from. So, for example, let's look at a classic example which I often talk about, but it's so illuminating that it's worth repeating. That let's say I want to look at the phenomena or let's say I want to look at the object. Let's take a rock. Okay, so there's a small piece of rock. The rock may be very jagged. It may have different kinds of colors reflecting on it, etc. But if you ask for a scientific description of that object, I may want to choose certain aspects which can be described in scientific terms. Okay, like I could talk about its density, something called weight. I can talk about at what pressure it cracks and so on. I may not talk about the light which is reflecting off it in the sunset. When during sunset, what happens to that rock? And the wind which is caressing that rock and going. Those are also truthful descriptions, correct? It is truthful empirically. You can see it. You can hear the wind flowing through it. It's not really perhaps not really scientific in the way we understand science. So it creates what it wants. It chooses things in order to be able to do something to it. In phenomena is another classic example where it does similar things. So let's look at the phenomena of motion. Like I said, well, motion is the central question for Newton. He begins his Principia with the idea of the three laws of motion and then the law of gravity and so on. And he begins by saying the whole task of this book is to understand the real meaning of what motion is, how to distinguish true and apparent motion. But how does somebody like Galileo, often called in history of science as the father of modern science, how would he describe motion? So we can go back to the stone which I hold in my hand and drop the stone, and the stone falls. And that's the phenomena. The phenomena is a falling stone. But the way I describe it, the way I take it into the fold of science, is to use concepts to describe it. And those concepts are special concepts. They are not concepts just of, very special concepts. And Galileo's great insight, and truly a very remarkable insight on what science really is to say that science is just the description of phenomena through measurable concepts. What he is also therefore trying to say is that there are many ways of describing a falling stone. I can use music to talk about it. I can talk about the light shimmering as a stone falls. But he says science, that is not doing science. That is okay, whatever it is. It could be something. It's not about whether that's true or false. But to do science is to say, I want to use only those concepts that are measurable in order to describe this phenomena. So I want to use height, the time it takes to fall, then creates new concepts called velocity, acceleration, and so on. And to me, one of the fascinating studies of a very simple concept, which shows the power of scientific ways of understanding the world, is this concept of acceleration. Again, it'll take me too far away from where I want to talk about, but just imagine where does this sudden concept called acceleration come in order to talk about a falling object? After all, before Galileo, for thousands of years, every civilization had built very powerful civilizations. They had built huge buildings. They had done enormous amount of progress in million things. They had fast moving chariots and objects which, were doing all that stuff. But yet, the concept acceleration was very, very special. And it is even today, it's actually a very deep philosophical question, and which even physicists may not have thought enough about, the significance of just one extra concept needed to understand all motion for Galilean physics. It's a really remarkable thing. Okay, so the other very important distinction which happens in the context of science, other than these kinds of ways of doing things, is that objects of science, which differentiates it from example from, let's say, cooking, football, etc., is that objects of science are not ordinarily perceptible. And this is again something which influences what becomes scientific method, because you have to create ways of convincing others that there are atoms, there are electrons, there are quarks, there are DNA, and the coronavirus. And actually it's quite remarkable how much society has changed from the time when people first looked through the microscope and said, no, we can't be true that we are seeing germs, not believing what they see through an instrument and saying what they see through the instrument is really these kind of germs which they can't see through the naked eye. We have come a long way from there to looking at coronavirus pictures every day in our news media, and each of them, depending on how loud our media is, they'll have different kinds of colors. And the only thing which they have not made is start the coronavirus sing on Hindi song. It's doing everything else. It can be red in color, purple in color. It's got these really ugly looking things poking out. They're very frightening objects which they create. And it's quite remarkable that we all think, wow, coronavirus looks like this. And that's what I mean by saying how much it has entered into social consciousness, that it is under the larger question of trust, I presume here, and although what kind of a trust it is still a complex question, that we think, oh, that's how coronavirus is. And we're not even asking the question, what does it actually mean to say the coronavirus actually looks like this ball with all these pointers? And yes, somebody will take a electron microscopic photograph and show it to you, and then we are not in a position to ask, why should we believe that? Not that we should ask that question. I'm asking, what happens to the social consciousness? What happens to the consciousness of billions of people, where when you are shown something which is never going to be accessible to you, even when you look through the instruments, it needs such training to see that you're not going to be able to see the coronavirus in the way with all this blue and orange and red color, that we still accept it. That it becomes part of not just our everyday talk, not our everyday discourse. It becomes a part of our everyday habits. We are all locked inside houses, imagining this spiky thing, dancing around everywhere around us. What kind of the movement of the scientific knowledge to social consciousness? How does it happen? And I think that's an important question for social scientists to think about. But here, when I look at what is so special to science here, again to distinguish it from sports science, management science, and even from social science. And this is also my critique of how social science has used the word science but has not learned some of the most important techniques of science, which is that science is not just about telling you, describing something about the world. It teaches us a particular way of seeing the world. It opens our eyes to the possibility of seeing things which you can never see. And therefore, how to see becomes an extremely important, the hidden hidden methodological question for science is just that. It is not enough to say that a scientist says, I know that there are electrons. I can even do some experiment and show you. The earliest experiments, including the cloud chamber experiments on electrons, are not showing you any electrons. They're just showing you some photographic, scratches on a plate. But for us to be able to see something more than what you're seeing through your eyes, that is scientific theory. In a very important sense, theory functions as the inner eye. It tells you how to be able to start seeing it. And then this whole process of seeing leads to a very interesting aspect of doing science. So I want you to keep this in the back of the mind, because when we come to the idea of scientific method, these are extremely important kinds of things to understand. So if I want to summarize what I've been saying so that I just go on, is to say that there is something special to the activity of doing science. It is to create new objects, open up new worlds which we haven't seen. It is to describe the world around us through measurable concepts, through a very specific set of concepts. And that itself is a very interesting debate. And it is a very particular notion of theorizing. And theory keeps coming all the time. And if you want a very quick thing of saying what is a theory, because again, when I talk about cooking or home science or sports science or wine science, etc., we may want to call them as science, but we have to ask them, are all these things happening within them to legitimize them as science? And is there a theory? So what does a theory do? A theory universalizes. It takes different phenomena which seem to be different from each other and shows you that they are the same. And that's a very remarkable kind of unification of different different kinds of phenomena. And that's something which social science, of course, does. I'll come back to it when we do a little bit more on social theories later on. And the theory explains, it uses ideas like laws, it analyzes, synthesizes, reproduces, predicts, and so on. Okay, I'm sure many of you are well aware of this kind of a thing. But when we now want to differentiate something from one thing to the other and say something is science and something is not science, we can ask, are these certain characters which will really make something a science or not a science? And the final point about this is that the science, and this is a really remarkable, we could do a whole module just on this, which has also been my own major interest in my own work, is the relationship between science and language. And a very good marker of science is the way it uses language, the way it uses, the way it modifies a language like English. That's why when you open a science textbook, even a science textbook, forget a research paper, the language seems very different. The text looks very different to you. It is almost like a comic book. There will be some words in English, then suddenly a graph, an equation will be there, then some other funny symbols will be filled with all kinds of funny symbols throughout the book. And you should be asking yourself, how do these scientists read such a book? What is the theory of reading that you need to be able to make sense of such a book? And why is it that scientists constantly are struggling to find a different language? Why does mathematics become so important to at least the classical physics, the definition of classical science? And the very influential Galilean idea that nature is an open book written in the language of mathematics. And doing science is just to read this open book written in mathematics. So the mathematics becomes very closely associated with the idea of science to the extent, and we know this very well, within science, when people were not doing science, for example, in the hierarchy of the sciences, you always historically, and I think it persists in many cases now, the theoretical physics would be very high in the totem pole. Then you come down to chemistry, and I know people in physics who look down on what chemists are doing by saying, look, they don't use mathematics, they're not really doing, the kind of science that we do, because it's far more, far more difficult, it's far more mathematical, far more abstract, whatever else it is. The question of mathematics is extremely important and a very, essential entry point we need in order to understand what is special to science, at least what is special to natural science. So when social science mimics certain characteristics of science, mathematics plays a very important role. So in economics, mimics itself more compared to, let's say, sociology by you mathematizing what it is doing. It is, it leads to all kinds of debates within social sciences and within, within the other disciplines. And, this debate continues between biology and physics, etc. Even today. But again, I'll come back to this question of language and mathematics later. In the context of society and the very idea of anthropology, the question of language comes back to the fore. So down the line, I will come back to this extremely important question of language. And why are we interested in the question of language? Because if science is about a description of the truths of the world, the way the world really is, then the description has to match that truth. And in this, science shares a lot with theology, because one of the most important questions in theology was whether the word of God gets diluted when it is written in the words of humans. Can the words of God even be given in the words of humans? Aren't human interests or the different types of human languages, do they not have the power to distort what the God's words are? And so there starts a search for finding the language of the gods. And you can see this with very many different traditions in Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so on. And this remains a very interesting question about the pure languages. It's very interesting that science shares the same concern, because the image of a scientist, from Galilean times, as somebody who is just recording what is there in the world. A scientist is truly a journalist, a reporter, in the traditional classical sense, not today's, all our TV journalists. It's a reporter in what sense? And again, it's not an accident that journalism, the very fundamental tenets of journalism and reporting draws a lot from scientific notions of reporting. Because the scientist is reporting what is there in the world. The scientist, she's not creating her likes and dislikes about the world. And like I always like to say, if Newton did not like the fact that the law of gravity was m1 m2 by r squared, and he said, wow, I wish it could have been m1 m2 by r cubed. I like cubes better than squares. Tough luck. There's nothing he can do about it, or he could have done about it. And that is the image which persists. That scientists are just describing what is there in the world. But then how do you know that the language of description is not going to distort the way the world is? So science has to function with this belief that language is a transparent medium. It does not distort what it describes. And this you can immediately see for all of you social scientists, what a major question this becomes when we want to describe societies and you want to search for languages which correctly describes social realities. Why do the scientists then think mathematics can describe nature so correctly without distorting the truth of that language? This is a very open question. It's an extremely important question, because one way to answer this is to say, well, Galileo answered it very well, and that was a wonderful political, rhetorical move by Galileo when he said, well, you scientists have to use mathematics to describe nature because mathematics is the language of nature. Just like if I'm describing a community, let's say Kannada speaking community, and I'm describing it in Kannada, what they are saying, and somebody asks me, why are you writing a Kannada report on it? I'll say, because the people whom I'm talking about, they're all Kannada speakers, and this is what they told me, therefore I'm writing it down. Now when Galileo says, well, mathematics, nature is anyway written in mathematics, and scientists have to be just recorders, transcribers of what they see in the open book, and just write it down. And you'll have to ask yourself the question, how do we recognize that mathematics is the language of nature? Because it seems to be a human creation. It's a very important socially created commodity, mathematics. There's a very fascinating history of mathematics. Among other social influences on mathematics is the simple thing of writing mathematics in particular way. creating symbolic writing, like writing x squared as write x and put 2 on top. Those are major cognitive revolutions in our understanding of mathematics. So how is it that this mathematics becomes the language of nature and scientists become transcribers, just plain reporters of nature? But this has become so influential that even today it becomes an extremely important way of understanding what scientists really do and how science derives its power by uh, by shifting the authority from scientists to nature. So by doing this, what they're saying is, look, I am not saying that this is how it is. Nature is like that. So don't ask me. I'm only opening that window for you. That's what is there outside us. And this allows science to completely negate a social created discourse called mathematics into a natural phenomena which describes nature. And there are very deep implications. So one way, therefore, to answer the question, larger question of how to distinguish between different kinds of, so whether science, wine science, sports science, or even social science, is to ask, what of these techniques do these things really use? If anybody wants to call themselves a science, do they do maybe some, if not all of these things? That gives us one entry into this question. But, if one of you is a little bit more skeptical could immediately ask me, do the different disciplines in science themselves, do they do all this? Does chemistry do exactly what physics is trying to do in terms of universalizing explanation laws? Does biology do exactly what, and now we have, as I said, hundreds of subfields in each of them. Are they all doing this kind of universal explain laws, analyze, synthesize, hypothesis, theory, new objects, etc.? And that, that is a much larger question, which I won't go into that, and because I want to end with a final point of putting all this together. But the quick answer to that would be that no. In fact, to give a very famous example from philosophy of science, even the idea of laws of nature, which are so important for physics, is not really found within biology. Biology's response to the question of laws are very different than what physics does. And, that's very special to the idea of physics. And so, let me give a one-line summary of a point I'll discuss as a separate talk later on, which is the fact that, which is I think a very important observation we need to note here, that when science, if we say that science is a study of nature and the natural world, then we have to recognize that the very idea of what is nature is different in each of these scientific disciplines. That is, physics, chemistry, biology, to take the three dominant categories, when they say we are describing nature, the word nature for them is very different, has different meanings. The way the physicists look at the idea of what constitutes the most important aspect of nature for them, and that is primarily the idea of laws of nature. That's very different from the way nature is understood for the discourse of chemistry, for the discourse of biology. The nature for biology, which biology uses as its study, object of study as a science, is very different than the nature which is used in physics. And what makes it so fascinating is that this very idea of nature seems to be socially developed. When I mean socially developed, does not mean social construction in some sense. That's why I'll do a separate talk on this point. But that a group of scientists come together to define nature in such a way to say that the essence of nature is laws of nature, and our task is to discover the laws of nature, like laws of electricity, laws of gravity, laws of motion, etc. And that is not really the description of nature for biology. It adds a completely different dimension, particularly through evolution, through living processes, biological systems, and so on. So they may all say that we are all talking about nature, but that nature itself is such a slippery, ambiguous term, which somehow seems to bring together all the sciences, But that's quite a slippery ground on which they all come together. And as I said, that's a very fascinating point, which I come back. So let me just end with these final comments so that we can take questions for a few minutes before I address some of them in the next part. Now, after having said all this, and I hope we get an idea of what science is from this, and I'm saying this not because I'm sure you might have known much of what I have said, but it is just to give us a common vocabulary as a group of us who are thinking through this question of science and society. So I'm saying this because whenever we talk about science and society in terms of values, or when scientists take for granted that this is what is so important to science, etc., as philosophers of science or historians of science, we inquire into it a little more deeper and find its different forms of manifestation. No truth is that simple. There are different layers of it, and it shows the complexity of the practice of science. And one of the most important complexities of science, which does not belong to much of what I told you earlier, which all fall under the idea of method, is the creative aspect of doing science. The creative, imaginative, metaphorical, narrative, storytelling capacity of doing science. And to me, and many scientists, I don't understand why they react, allergically to this. I think that's one of the greatest strengths of it, because there is an ideological understanding of science, that science is all about rationality and logical. And if you really ask a scientist, what do you mean by logic and rationality, that can lead to a very interesting debate with them. But what is far more interesting is that by saying that, they negate a very important aspect of doing science. Just imagine this. How is it that thousands of people in a society are able to think up of crazy stories about the universe, about the world? Where are these stories coming from? That narrative imagination. Again, I must tell you that when we have talked about in common platforms with scientists and non-scientists, and I use the word stories, they get really upset, in the sense they feel like we are negating it as fiction. No, I'm just pointing out to the creative imagination, the metaphorical imagination, the analogical influence, which has deeply influenced the kinds of production of new scientific knowledge. All the kinds of questions we talked about, new concepts, new objects, logic of seeing something which you cannot see, etc., is a very important aspect of science. But if you add these elements of the creative, the imaginative, the metaphorical, then you realize a very important, profound truth about science. And that is that the discourse of the real, because if there is one sentence by which you describe science is a description of the real. And description is just a very limited term, so I use the word discourse of the real, the ways of talking about the real, the ways of opening up the ideas of the real. But what is astounding is that a discourse of the real, which is what science is concerned with, is completely built using the unreals. Things like mathematical objects. Mathematical objects are not objects in our world. Numbers, sets, matrices, functions, points, lines, they are not material objects in this world. They are not empirical objects available to us to touch and hold. They are abstract objects. They are non-spatio-temporal objects. And yet, without mathematics, you do not have some of the most profound descriptions of the reality of the universe. And in a long piece which I had written earlier, which is called Literary Reality and Scientific Fiction, I was just pointing to the fact that literature draws much more on the real world in order to tell you a fictional story. Whereas science draws much more on the imaginary world in order to tell you a true story. I find that a very fascinating dynamics happening there, between science and literature there. And you can see in another way in which this kind of imagination, this creative imagination of science functions, which is the role of models. And again, this is something which speaks closely to social science, because for example, when you have the atomic model, and when Bohr proposes an atomic model like a planetary model, with the sun at the center and the earth and the planets going around the sun, you have a planetary model of the atom, where the nucleus is the sun and all the electrons are going around that nucleus. So it's a lovely picture. It's a, it's a simple picture. You immediately grasp what he is trying to say. And then you do a lot of calculation, etc., etc. But model making in science is really not about the real world. It's about an idealized world. It's about a reductive world. So, for example, as I'm sure many physics students would know, if you want to talk about the basic first lessons in physics, you would begin by, let's say a pendulum oscillating. You would not take into account friction. You will not consider the thickness of the wire. You will take a very smooth bob which is oscillating, and that's a model, because it's through that you can solve some mathematical equations. But the question this raises is, are then scientific descriptions descriptions of the model? Models are imaginary, idealized models. They are not the real world. So how does the movement of knowledge about an ideal move towards the real? That's again a very fascinating philosophical discussion about science which you need to understand. Okay, and to add to the complexity of all this is that some of the most important new developments in science have all been accidental, many of them. I mean, you can just go look at the list of hundreds of major discoveries, including many discoveries which have won the Nobel Prize, which have been accidental, serendipitous, not expected, unexpected discoveries, discoveries which have come from mistakes done in the lab, mistakes done in calculations. And yet, they become a very important part of science, because many people have pointed out, I mean, very famously, a philosopher of science, Hans Reichenbach, points out that all this belongs to the ways in which you discover things in science, but the real act of science lies in the way we justify them. So I may have accidentally discovered something, but science lies in the way we justify these observations, these truths of the world. But that is, I think, a very limited picture which misses out on extremely rich cognitive processes which happens in this imaginative world of science. And the last point I leave for today is this, that much of what I've been talking about, almost all these qualities of the science are all, point to a very important part of element of science, which is that science is inherently social. And we need to ask, again, it's like evidence, and what does it stand for? Okay, just because we say this, we may conclude many things. I'm not coming to the conclusion now. We have enough time to build upon it. But everything about this is social, because science is inherently collaborative, to the extent that today, if I'm right, it's I think more, but at the lower limit, apparently more than 80% of research publications in science are all co-authored publications. Today you have publications which have 1,000+ authors as research publications. So mainly most of them in experimental particle physics. But still, the idea that very, very difficult. It's only in some branches of, it's only in mathematics and some parts of theoretical physics that you still get single authored papers. And it's only in philosophy you also get single authored papers. It says a lot about the activities of these theorists and philosophers. The collaborative effort now defines much of what we mean by science. And what I mean by collaborative is, it's impossible to get scientific knowledge because it depends on what others have done or will do. And this leads to a very important tension between the individual and the social. And that crux of the tension, the fulcrum of the tension, is really captured in the context of science. On the one hand, you have the great geniuses like Newton and Einstein who are coming up with wonderful so-called scientific truths, but they are very deeply social processes. But if you also want to look at science as beyond society, beyond human, scientific truths are transcendental truths. They are beyond human. They are about nature, whatever that nature is. That tension really influences a lot of the tension between science and society. And when we migrate these practices of science into studying society, we see what kind of strengths are there, but what kind of weaknesses are also present in that, which we will pick up in tomorrow's session. Okay, so if that's okay with Ritesh, I'll just stop here and we can probably take a few questions now.
I was just proposing that we could
Yeah.
open the chat box and
Okay. Yeah.
individuals can put in their
Sure.
questions,
Yeah.
whatever they want, and perhaps from there we can take a couple of questions.
Okay. Sure.
So I'll invite all the participants to put down their thoughts, questions in the chat box. Even if it would be difficult to address all of them over here together, but we'll consolidate it and send it over to Professor Sundar for taking it in the next time, the next talk.
Yeah, so in the remaining few minutes, I can try and quickly connect to some of them to see, whether we could very quickly respond. Okay, this chat thing is moving so fast. Okay, there's an interesting question about language. I'll come back to that when we look at questions of language and social science there. I'm looking at specifically whether there are questions related to different types of sciences, questions of what really, constitute, things that, okay, there are actually quite a few questions about language. So let me connect it perhaps to that and also see if it answers some of these questions. So there is this very, I think it still is an interesting, difficult question about whether, certain languages are special in some sense, and you can extend this right from as I said, Hebrew, Latin, Arabic, Sanskrit as religious traditions of languages and religious traditions, along with other vernacular languages, spoken languages of various kinds. You also have mathematics and technical languages which fall under that. And one of the very big problem about the question of language has been that language often seems to be exclusionary. It seems to need certain competences which keep certain people outside. And I think a very good way in which you can see that is in the debate on so-called Indian language versus English medium languages in the Indian education system. Does possessing English create a kind of a hierarchy within society? And you could ask the same question, therefore, about mathematical thing or with any of the other so-called, classical languages of this kind. And it's also, and again, remember that one of the first egalitarian moves which comes with Buddhism and Jainism against Brahminical Hinduism was to go to the level of languages, to go to Pali and Prakrit as against Sanskrit in order to be able to negate the hold which language does. And therefore, the question of gatekeeping is functioning at the level of language itself. And the question of mathematics makes this all far more interesting and complex, because we also know that among all the languages which people learn in school, I'm talking particularly about school education, so many of you are in education, there seems to be a special problem about mathematics. We know that for many students who do not do science, who enter into humanities and social science, for example, very often there are so many who have told me that, look, there are things which I have liked in maybe physics or biology or something, but I can't do maths. And I think many times it's because of teachers, because to me, I think the best way to teach maths is like you teach a new language. They share a lot in common. But what has happened is this capacity for mathematics seems to have somehow created a social hierarchy. It has become a particular kind of a filtering mechanism that, today, and again, look at how mutely, how silently the society has accepted this with very little feedback mechanism, with very little resistance, which is that, you write any entrance exam for any kind of course in India today, you'll be doing something on mathematics. It began with all this GRE and all the GATE exam and so on. And I always found it very odd that the early CAT exams, I've heard some changes have been made, but CAT exams and all those management exams used to have, you know, really high-speed mathematics questions, like, I don't know, 100 questions in 30 minutes and stuff. And no wonder that you just have some largely, you know, science students and engineering students in management. But I often wondered, what is this relevance? You are training people into a complete domain which includes human relationship, okay, engaging with the larger society, thinking about notions of transaction, commerce, etc. And we think that mathematics, some kind of very fast solving of questions in algebra, geometry, etc., is going to be used. And when I was telling this to one of my friends who was in architecture, he said, you know, he said all architecture entrance tests have become like that. And he said, I can't ask a question on the spatial visualization because they think, oh, that's all art question you're asking, but they'll give them some quick maths question to do. So this hierarchy, this hegemony of the kind of the role and place of mathematics has a very deep gender question. And there have been very important scientists who have worked on this and communities about how gender has functioned within the maths community, for example, in maths education. So one could ask the question, does this reflect on certain questions within science? You know, is language a very central question at all? But on the other hand, you have had remarkable success of scientific theorizing using mathematics. You know, there are very interesting stories about how certain kinds of mathematics, for example, group theory, which completely revolutionizes particle physics, and group theory had already been done, people knew enough about it 100 years back, but a rediscovery of it allowed a completely new, amazing growth of physics to happen. So, you know, there are these kinds of very ambiguous questions, and that's why very famously Eugene Wigner coined the phrase, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, because he said, look, I don't understand why mathematics should work, but why is it so essential to science? And why is the puzzle, why are they all puzzled? Whether it's Newton, Galileo, Einstein, all of them are puzzled by the way in which mathematics functions within sciences. They're puzzled because they don't see mathematics as an empirical language, but it seems to function in that particular, it becomes necessary for an empirical sciences. So I do think this larger question of language and science becomes extremely important. And you can see that in the way science engages with the English itself, how it modifies the English language. So many times we do this in social sciences and humanities. People will say, well, you know, you're so much full of jargon, we're not able to understand it. Typically, when scientists listen to your talk in social science, I mean, having been in structures in which this used to happen, their first standard response would be, oh, you guys are just talking so much in jargon, you know, when something is so easy for us to understand. But when they write a simple equation or use a concept like energy and force, it is as much a jargon within their domain as other jargons are within social sciences. But the question which social science therefore has to ask is, why is the engagement of social science with language much less dynamic than what science has done? You know, that's a much larger question, may not be of particular relevance to what we are doing here, but I thought since there are many of you from that field, I would just highlight that. Okay. Okay, the questions on faith, etc., I'll definitely come when we do the religion thing, because I'll set up the system, because rather than answering the question, let's try and see how to think through that by looking at the thing, right? Okay, so let me therefore end perhaps with another point on rationality, because I can see there are some, because we have, you know, been looking at questions of rationality. I will do a separate one on the specific ideas of scientific rationality versus social rationality. But the larger question here is this. You know, science has to build walls around itself. That's very clear. In an ideal world, you know, science I'm sure they would be willing to accept, you know, craftsmen as being part of science, different kinds of practices as being scientific. But part of the reason why science creates this demarcation question, okay, famously by Popper, And later on now in Indian science debate is all about this demarcation questions. Their fear that, you know, the value given to science is going to be appropriated by other activities. For to really understand that, we have to go back to the idea of the colonial discourse. There's a very strong, you know, underlying historical discourse about the value of science and the value of the rationality associated with science. And that mimics the earlier question about the value given to philosophy. So when you read very important philosophers in Europe talking about the fact that Asian societies, including India, of course, Asian and African societies did not just that they did not have science and mathematics and philosophy, they did not have the capacity for science, logic, philosophy, etc. And that what they did not possess, what all of us did not have, is a capacity for rationality, capacity to engage in the question of logic. So it's so in one sense, the question of rationality in science, the question of logic and scientific temper within science and logic, has got this inheritance. And you need to be very brave to say, look, I am willing to talk about the enormous creativity of doing science, the enormous complexity of how they come up with these kinds of concepts, which many of the other communities do not produce, and so on. Rather, you know, and completely removing all of it and reducing science in a narrow sense to some kind of so-called linear rationality. And that's not the way science works. We have enormous evidence about it. So when they do that, just have to be careful. And my only point about it is, you just have to be careful where you're using it ideologically, for ideological purposes, for cultures and traditions and within nations, and within giving a value of European society as being far superior to Asian and African. And this becomes a very important tool to do that. So we need to ask that question, and therefore, to me, it's very important to understand that the methods of justification in science are very rigorous, but it does not mean that there is a proliferation of creative thinking which is happening in sciences. So one way to say this, you know, the thing which I really like to think of it this way is that if you look at the number of publications, there are, you know, maybe 20 to 30,000 journals publishing in science today, and you have many of them publishing weekly, and the average rate can range from acceptance rate of papers sent to these papers can range maybe from 5% in major journals to, let's say, 20 to 30% in other journals. So on an average, you're looking at, let's say, 15 to 20%. On a higher range, at least 20% of papers which are sent to them are published, right? Now, remember that the criterion for publication is originality. You have contributed some new idea to the world of knowledge. You have created, you know, every week, think about this, every week you have thousands of pages of so-called new original work which are produced. You think all of them are true? That even though it has come and been published in a scientific journal after peer evaluation, are they all talking about the truth of the world? Or are they talking about possible narratives? And that's very important. They are justified narratives. They are basically telling you that, look, it could be this way. And maybe when experimenters do it, they will discover something is that way or not. But the fact that you can say it could be this way, and that is seen as part of your research production, says a lot about this thing about science. Okay? And I think that's something which we need to really think about. You know, what is the nature of the production of scientific knowledge? Forget about the established theories which you have got. To get the textbook on what you read today, that little bit of work that you read today in each of the scientific disciplines, you have had an army of people producing work. Right? Army of people, and billions and billions of rupees or dollars or whatever it is that you have spent on them. So how do we evaluate the piece of knowledge? Today, Scientometrics as a community, they're very important contributors from India, like Professor Subhaya Arunachalam and his colleagues, who have been looking at some of these things, and they give us some idea of understanding how to make sense of these kinds of productions of papers. But it's the social scientists and philosophers and others who should, and discourse analysts and others like that, who should really look at the nature of knowledge, the amount of knowledge which is supposedly being produced week after week in these publications. So if 20% are being produced, remember that for every 20 paper published, 80 papers are being rejected. And all the 80 papers, those authors thought they were doing something original and something of value. Are we producing so much original, new knowledge in the world? So there is a real deep crisis of understanding the nature of scientific knowledge today. What is this character of the scientific knowledge? Because remember, we are seeing the end products of some influential big one, okay? And so we have to figure out how we are going to make sense of this. How are we going to understand what kind of nature of the knowledge which is being produced? So hopefully, I think what we have done today is to be able to equip ourselves with a little more set of tools to engage with this question of science when we take this to address a question of its relationship with society. For example, can we just do physics of society? Can we do various other things like that? So that is really what I think we will do. Just as a final comment, perhaps I'll end with this point so that we can think about it before we come on Tuesday, is that for example, when I look at a scientific object, remember that I was saying that science is preparing an object so that it can study it and say something about it. So you could look at the example I really like is, let's say, for example, a social phenomena called poverty. So there is something called poverty. Now, just giving you poverty is not amenable for scientific analysis because it does not know what to do with this term called poverty. Because poverty can have many associations, it can have experiences, it can have various other kinds of things associated with it. So what we do is, science will then reduce poverty and describe it in terms of, let's say, measurable concepts. So for example, attempts to describe poverty in terms of calorific intake every day, or amount of money per day, how much you can earn. Everybody who earns less than 30 rupees a day is poor, etc. Those definitions become measurable. But we know that. That's a quantitative attempt. But what is the quantitative doing? It is preparing an object. It's preparing a concept called poverty, making it amenable for scientific description. So while doing it, you ignore various other aspects which you can't deal with. So it's almost like in personal relationships, you say, well, I can deal with this, so I'm going to deal with this. Other things I can't deal with it, I'm going to ignore. That's what disciplines do. That's what philosophy does, science does, social science does, and so on. So, it's a way to think about how science really operates in the larger context, and we'll pick up some of that, and, we'll come back. I know there are these very important questions about traditional thing, questions of traditional knowledge, Ayurveda, etc. We'll definitely come back to it when we look at the other aspects of society in their relationship with this. Is that okay, Ritesh?
Yes. It's a very, interesting question that keeps in our mind. For the next meeting. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ritesh. And if you can just send me this chat questions, it'll be.
Yes. Yeah. I'll do that, sir.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it right now for a few minutes, but later on you can just. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Yeah.
A couple of announcements from Devansh for the participants. Devansh, could you please go in?
Yeah, thank you, sir, and good evening to everyone. That was a wonderful session by Professor Sundar. I hope everyone has enjoyed that. We'll be looking forward for the next session by Sundar sir. That will be session 3. And I would like to inform all the participants that whoever has already registered for this webinar series, and so there is no need of the registration for this webinar again. That is for session 3. You will be getting an updated email before the session. And also we are uploading these sessions on YouTube. So you may follow the link and you can watch it on YouTube whenever you want. Thank you. Thank you so much.